Early 1942. The Pacific Ocean stretched wide and hostile, its waters now a battlefield. The Japanese Empire had surged forward in a wave of victories that stunned the world. At Pearl Harbor, their planes had struck without warning, sinking American battleships and crippling the U.S. Pacific Fleet. In the weeks that followed, Japanese forces swept through the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies. They captured islands and harbors at a pace that seemed unstoppable. In Tokyo, the mood inside the Imperial Japanese Navy headquarters was confident. Officers studied maps marked with red flags showing their new conquests. They believed the United States had been dealt a blow so severe that it would take years to recover. Japan's admirals planned their next moves assuming that no major American fleet could challenge them for a long time. At forward bases scattered across the Pacific, Japanese captains felt the same certainty. They had seen the results of Pearl Harbor with their own eyes. Battleships like the USS Arizona and Oklahoma lay wrecked in the mud. Dry docks were damaged. Oil reserves burned for days. The American Navy, in their view, had been crippled. Then, a new report reached the highest levels of Japan's naval command. Intelligence officers had intercepted information from American sources. The United States had begun construction on 10 new battleships, and not at the slow pace Japan expected. American shipyards were working around the clock. Massive hulls were being laid down in multiple locations at the same time. At first, the report was met with disbelief. Some senior officers dismissed it as exaggerated or false. They could not imagine how a nation that had just suffered a devastating attack could organize such a massive program so quickly. Japan's own experience told them that battleships took years to build. Their largest vessels, like the Yamato and Musashi, had required vast resources and intense labor over many years. But as more reports arrived, the truth became harder to deny. These were not rumors. The Americans were indeed building 10 new battleships at once. Each would be armed with heavy guns, thick armor, and modern fire control systems. The news spread quietly through the Japanese fleet. Captains stationed at Truk, Rabaul, and other forward bases discussed it in hushed tones. In one wardroom, an officer unrolled a map and marked the projected locations where these ships might first appear. He traced lines showing possible routes of attack once they joined the fleet. His fellow officers watched in silence, their faces grim. The balance of power they had counted on was already starting to shift. American shipyards had an advantage that Japan lacked: sheer industrial capacity. Across the U.S., cities like Newport News, Brooklyn, and Philadelphia turned into centers of war production. Civilian factories were converted to produce naval guns, engines, and steel plates. Workers labored day and night, often in 12-hour shifts. Assembly lines sped up construction in ways the Japanese had never attempted. The scale was staggering. Where Japan could build one battleship, America could build several at the same time. Huge cranes lifted entire sections of hulls into place. Welding crews sealed seams in record time. As one ship neared completion, another began construction in the next slipway. This speed shocked Japanese planners. They had assumed that time was on their side. Their strategy depended on maintaining naval superiority long enough to secure a defensive perimeter and force the United States to negotiate. With 10 new battleships coming online, that plan was in danger. Inside Japanese headquarters, strategy meetings grew tense. Some argued for an immediate decisive battle before the new ships could be deployed. Others urged caution, fearing that a rushed attack might expose weaknesses in their own fleet. The debate revealed a deeper problem. Japan's war plan had been built on underestimating American industry. For U.S. sailors and shipyard workers, the story was different. At the Brooklyn Navy Yard, men and women stood shoulder to shoulder as they built these giants of steel. Many had never worked on ships before the war, but training was rapid and precise. Every rivet, every plate, every gun mount brought the fleet closer to full strength. There was no time for celebration. The memory of Pearl Harbor drove them to work harder. When the first of these new battleships slid down the ways and into the water, crowds gathered to watch. The ships were sleek, powerful, and fast. They carried 16-inch main guns capable of firing shells over 20 miles. Their engines could drive them at speeds unmatched by older designs. They were not just replacements for the ships lost at Pearl Harbor. They were improvements built to fight and win in a modern war. Back in the Pacific, Japanese scouts began to report sightings of unfamiliar American warships. At first, they were seen only at a distance, silhouettes against the horizon. Soon, however, they would appear in force, leading convoys and supporting carrier groups. Japanese captains who had once sailed with confidence now faced an enemy that was stronger and growing stronger by the month. For the officers at sea, the change was deeply personal. They had believed their early victories would guarantee Japan's security. Now, as they stood on their bridges and watched enemy fleets grow, they felt a weight they had not expected. Some wrote in their diaries about the sense of inevitability creeping over them. Others hardened their resolve, vowing to fight on despite the odds. The shock was not only in the numbers but in the speed. Japan had believed it had time to consolidate its gains. The arrival of 10 new American battleships shattered that belief. It forced every captain, every admiral, and every strategist to reconsider what was possible in this war. The news of 10 new American battleships spread through the Pacific like a ripple turning into a wave. At first, Japanese commanders thought the reports must be wrong. It seemed impossible. Battleships were the largest and most complex weapons a nation could build. They required millions of pounds of steel, thousands of workers, and years of careful construction. Japan itself had struggled to complete its own giants like the Yamato and Musashi. Each ship was a national project that stretched resources to the breaking point. But the reports were not wrong. The United States had not only started building new battleships, it had done so on a scale the world had never seen before. In shipyards from Virginia to California, massive hulls began to rise from dry docks. The Americans were not replacing what had been lost at Pearl Harbor with identical ships. They were building stronger, faster, and more powerful warships, designed for a new era of naval combat. Two classes of battleships stood out: the Iowa class and the South Dakota class. These were not experimental designs. They were practical machines of war, built with lessons learned from years of naval planning. The Iowa class, in particular, would become legendary. Each ship displaced more than 45,000 tons. Their main guns were 9 16-inch rifles mounted in 3 turrets, capable of hurling shells the size of small cars over 20 miles. These shells could smash through the thick armor of enemy warships or pound coastal fortifications before an invasion. The secondary batteries were almost as impressive. They included dual-purpose 5-inch guns that could fire at surface targets or defend against aircraft. Layers of anti-aircraft weapons covered the decks, giving these ships a strong defense against the growing threat from the air. Fire control systems tied everything together. Radars, optical rangefinders, and plotting rooms allowed the crew to track targets and adjust fire with remarkable accuracy. Speed was another advantage. Many older battleships were slow, rarely exceeding 21 knots. The Iowa-class ships were built for 33 knots. That speed allowed them to keep pace with the newest aircraft carriers, a vital change as carriers became the dominant force in modern warfare. The armor was equally advanced. The hulls were wrapped in layers of steel designed to resist torpedoes, bombs, and heavy shells. Bulkheads and compartmentalization increased their survivability. Even a direct hit might not sink them if damage control crews acted quickly. These ships were floating fortresses, built to absorb punishment and keep fighting. The South Dakota-class ships, though slightly smaller, were still formidable. They carried the same 16-inch main guns and heavy secondary batteries, but they were more compact and had improved armor protection in key areas. Together, the Iowa and South Dakota classes gave the U.S. Navy a modern, balanced battle line ready for the challenges of the Pacific. Building even one ship of this kind would have been a challenge for most nations. Building 10 at the same time was almost unthinkable. But America's strength lay not only in its navy, but in its industry. Across the country, factories and shipyards worked at a pace that stunned foreign observers. At Newport News, giant cranes moved massive steel sections into place like pieces of a puzzle. Welding crews swarmed over the hulls day and night. Sparks showered the docks as they sealed seams and reinforced bulkheads. At the Brooklyn Navy Yard, production lines turned out the complex parts needed to outfit the ships. Turrets, guns, boilers, and radar systems arrived by rail from factories scattered across the United States. This coordination was no accident. The U.S. had spent years developing systems to manage large-scale industrial projects. Now those systems were focused entirely on the war effort. Civilian factories that once made cars or refrigerators shifted to producing naval equipment. Entire neighborhoods near shipyards became housing for workers. Trains delivered steel, oil, and machinery on tight schedules, ensuring there were no delays. For many workers, this was their first time involved in shipbuilding. Training was fast and direct. A man who had been a farmer or mechanic 1 month could be part of a welding crew the next. Women entered the workforce in large numbers, taking on jobs that had once been reserved for men. Every hand was needed to meet the deadlines. Japan had nothing like this. Its shipyards were skilled, but they were few and limited by resources. The construction of a battleship like the Yamato consumed vast amounts of steel and manpower, straining Japan's economy. When the war began, Japan lacked the industrial base to expand its fleet rapidly. While American yards could launch several ships in a single year, Japan could barely finish one. The difference showed in the way the ships were built. In Japan, work proceeded slowly, step by step, with careful attention to detail but little speed. In the United States, construction resembled an assembly line on a massive scale. Large sections of hulls were built separately, then joined together. This modular approach allowed different teams to work at the same time. As the first of the new American battleships neared completion, Japanese intelligence reported their progress with growing alarm. Admirals studied photographs of the Iowa class and realized these ships were unlike anything they had faced before. Their speed and firepower meant they could escort carriers, chase down cruisers, and outmatch most enemy battleships. The Japanese Navy had entered the war believing that quality could offset quantity. Their ships were well-designed, their crews highly trained. But against the sheer scale of American production, that belief began to crack. 10 new battleships were not just numbers on a page. They were a sign that the United States could replace losses faster than Japan could inflict them. When Japanese officers saw images of American shipyards, they were struck by the size and organization. Endless rows of cranes, docks filled with half-finished hulls, workers moving in synchronized patterns. It was a vision of industrial warfare unlike anything in the Pacific. For them, it was clear that this was not just a fight between fleets. It was a contest between two nations' entire economies. The Americans understood this as well. They were not merely building ships. They were creating a machine of war, one that would keep running until victory was achieved. Each battleship that slid into the water was proof of that commitment, a visible reminder that the war would be fought with steel, speed, and relentless production. The first American battleships began to appear in the Pacific in mid-1942. At first, they were only glimpsed at a distance, their gray hulls low on the horizon. Japanese scouts reported these sightings with care, unsure if their observations would be believed. The Imperial Navy had grown used to having the most powerful ships in the Pacific. From the moment of Pearl Harbor onward, their battleships and carriers had sailed where they wished, supported by cruisers and destroyers that faced little serious opposition. Now, there were reports of new American warships, fast, heavily armed, and unlike the older ships Japan had destroyed at Pearl Harbor. The Japanese captains who received this news felt the shift immediately. They had once relied on speed and surprise to control the seas. With these new battleships entering service, they could no longer assume dominance. Their carefully planned routes and attack patterns were now at risk. At sea, Japanese commanders began to alter their movements. Convoys moved under heavier escort. Submarines were ordered to focus on finding and sinking these new threats. Carrier groups sailed with more caution, aware that an enemy surface fleet might appear where none had been before. Even a rumor of an American battleship nearby was enough to change the course of a patrol. Inside Tokyo, the news sparked urgent debate. In the war rooms of the Imperial Navy, maps covered the walls, each marked with pins and notes showing Japanese advances and expected enemy positions. Senior officers gathered around these maps late into the night. The lighting was dim, the atmosphere tense. Cigarette smoke hung in the air as they argued over their next move. Some officers urged immediate action. They believed Japan must force a decisive battle while its fleet still held the upper hand. Waiting would only give the Americans time to finish their new battleships and carriers. These men pointed to past victories and argued that another bold strike, like Pearl Harbor, could cripple the enemy once again. Others counseled caution. They warned that Japan could not afford heavy losses. Unlike the United States, they could not replace ships quickly. If a decisive battle ended in a draw or even a costly victory, it might still weaken Japan beyond repair. Their voices were quieter, but they carried weight. The decision would shape the future of the war. Across the ocean, the mood in American planning rooms was different. In Washington, Admiral Ernest King and Admiral Chester Nimitz studied their own maps. Their strategy sessions were filled with numbers, tonnage, fuel supplies, and ship movements tracked on large boards. They were aware of Japan's early dominance, but they could see the growing strength of their own fleet. The new battleships gave them options they had lacked only months earlier. Instead of defending against Japanese attacks, they could begin to think about taking the offensive. King and Nimitz discussed plans for an island-hopping campaign, striking at key points across the Pacific rather than confronting every Japanese base directly. These plans required a strong fleet to protect carriers and amphibious forces. The arrival of the Iowa-class and South Dakota-class ships made such operations possible. On both sides, the pace of planning quickened. For the Japanese, the focus was on identifying where the Americans might strike first. They expected attacks on their outer defensive ring of islands. Patrols increased. Air reconnaissance was expanded. Commanders were told to prepare for sudden and unpredictable enemy moves. For the Americans, the question was timing. The fleet was growing but not yet complete. Carriers were essential and battleships would protect them. Each week brought more ships into service, shifting the balance further. Nimitz and his staff considered where they could strike and still hold the initiative. The decision to move on Midway Island was shaped by these calculations. As plans formed, the tension at sea increased. Japanese submarines hunted for convoys carrying supplies to the American fleet. U.S. patrol aircraft scouted Japanese bases, looking for signs of enemy movements. Each side tried to guess the other's intentions, knowing that a single mistake could be disastrous. In one Japanese strategy session, an officer spread a set of photographs across the table. They showed an American battleship under construction, its hull already towering above the dockyard workers below. The image silenced the room. No one doubted the reports now. The Americans were building at a rate Japan could not match. The question was no longer if these ships would appear, but when. On the American side, shipyard reports flowed into planning rooms. Completion dates were tracked carefully. Each new ship meant more strength for upcoming operations. Officers discussed how to integrate the fast Iowa-class battleships with carrier task forces. Their speed meant they could keep pace with carriers, providing direct firepower and heavy escort protection. The effect on morale was profound. Japanese sailors who once sailed with confidence now faced an enemy that was growing stronger with every passing month. The Americans, meanwhile, gained confidence as their fleet expanded. The memory of Pearl Harbor still burned, but now it fueled determination rather than despair. When the Battle of Midway approached, both sides understood its significance. For Japan, it was a chance to destroy American carriers before the full weight of the new fleet came to bear. For the United States, it was a step toward seizing the initiative. The presence of even a few of the new battleships added to American strength, giving their commanders flexibility they had lacked before. The clash at Midway would not be decided by battleships alone, but their arrival marked a turning point. From this moment forward, Japanese captains knew they could never again assume superiority. Every plan they made had to account for the growing American fleet. The Pacific, once a Japanese lake, was becoming contested water. As the months passed, the drama only deepened. In Tokyo, meetings grew more desperate as losses mounted. In American war rooms, plans became more ambitious. The new battleships, once lines on a blueprint, now steamed across the ocean in formation, ready for battle. The balance of power had begun to shift. and neither side could mistake what that meant for the war ahead. The first reports were met with silence. In Tokyo, the intelligence officer who delivered the news stood at attention, reading from his notes. 10 American battleships were under construction, with some already nearing completion. The room of senior officers listened, their faces hard and unreadable. When he finished, there was no applause or outburst, only quiet disbelief. A few exchanged uneasy glances. Others stared at the maps spread across the table, as if searching for an answer they could not find. For months, the Imperial Japanese Navy had believed it held a decisive edge. The attack on Pearl Harbor had destroyed or damaged much of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Japanese ships sailed unchallenged across the Pacific, taking island after island. Their victories had been swift and absolute. The idea that America could already be building a new fleet at such a pace seemed impossible. One captain, a veteran of earlier campaigns, spoke first. He said the reports must be exaggerated. Even with American industry, no nation could replace so many ships so quickly. Others nodded in agreement. They wanted to believe that the intelligence was flawed, that this was a false alarm. Japan's own battleships had taken years to build. The mighty Yamato had required vast resources and careful work, each stage completed with precision. The thought that the Americans could do this 10 times over defied their understanding of naval warfare. But more reports followed. Submarine scouts confirmed the growing activity around American shipyards. Photographs showed hulls rising in dry docks, their size unmistakable. Supply convoys carried heavy guns, armor plate, and engines across the United States. The evidence was undeniable. Doubt gave way to a quiet, creeping fear. A Japanese officer named Commander Sato wrote in his diary that night. His entry was simple but striking. He described looking at a grainy photograph of an Iowa-class battleship under construction. The massive hull towered over the workers below, its sheer scale overwhelming. Sato wrote, "It is as if they are building an impossible fleet. Each ship they raise is another shadow on the horizon. I fear we do not understand the enemy we face." His words captured the private thoughts many officers dared not speak aloud. In forward bases like Truk and Rabaul, the reaction among captains was equally grim. News traveled slowly, but once confirmed, it spread quickly through the fleet. Wardrooms that had once been filled with confident talk of victory grew tense and quiet. Captains gathered over maps, calculating the time it would take for the new ships to reach the Pacific. They debated what routes those ships might take and how they might be used in battle. Some argued for bold action while there was still time. Others spoke of conserving strength, knowing replacements would never come fast enough. For younger officers, the emotional toll was heavy. Many had joined the Navy believing Japan's early victories would secure its future. They had been trained to think of their fleet as the most advanced in the world. Now, they faced the prospect of fighting an enemy with growing resources and endless reserves. Some wrote letters home that hinted at their unease, though few dared to speak openly of defeat. While Japanese officers struggled with fear and frustration, the mood in America was very different. In the great shipyards of Newport News, Brooklyn, and Philadelphia, workers toiled day and night. The work was exhausting and dangerous, but there was pride in it. Many had brothers, sons, or husbands serving overseas. Building ships was their way of fighting back after the shock of Pearl Harbor. Women filled roles that had once been closed to them, welding steel and operating heavy machinery. Men who had never seen the ocean before now built the largest warships in history. Their efforts turned abstract plans into physical reality. Each finished hull was proof that America was not beaten, and never would be. In the Navy, the arrival of the new battleships was a boost to morale. Sailors who had survived the attack on Pearl Harbor still carried the memory of burning oil and sinking ships. When they saw the sleek lines of the Iowa-class and South Dakota-class for the first time, it was like seeing a promise kept. These ships were faster, tougher, and more heavily armed than anything they had lost. Crews took pride in their assignments, knowing they would sail aboard the most powerful vessels in the world. One young sailor described his first day aboard a newly completed battleship. He wrote to his parents about the size of the guns, the gleaming decks, and the smell of fresh paint. "It feels like we are part of something much bigger than ourselves," he said. "This ship is not just steel, it's hope." His words echoed the feelings of many across the fleet. Back in Tokyo, Japanese officers read the latest intelligence reports with growing unease. They knew these new ships were already being integrated into American task forces. They also knew that every month would bring more. Some tried to hide their frustration, but it showed in clenched fists and clipped tones. Commander Sato wrote again in his diary after a long meeting. "We sat in silence while the admiral spoke of strategy," he recorded. "But all I could see were those ships in my mind. Their guns, their speed, their endless numbers. It is as if the ocean itself is turning against us." His private words reflected a reality the Japanese command could no longer deny. For the men at sea, the change was immediate. Patrols became more dangerous. Rumors of American battleships moving through the area spread quickly. Some crews reported hearing distant gunfire at night, a sign that the enemy was closer than ever. The confidence that had carried them through the early months of the war began to fade. The reactions on both sides revealed the deeper truth of the conflict. For Japan, each new American ship was a reminder of limits they could not overcome. For the United States, every ship launched was a step toward reclaiming the Pacific. In shipyards and on the open sea, human hands and human hearts were shaping the course of the war. The arrival of the new American battleships marked a change that could be felt across the Pacific. In the early months of the war, Japanese ships had sailed wherever they wished. Their carriers and battleships struck without warning, hammering Allied bases from Hawaii to the Philippines. The Imperial Navy had ruled the ocean like an empire unto itself. There had been no serious challenge to their dominance. That time was ending. When the first of the Iowa-class and South Dakota-class battleships entered service, they were more than replacements for the ships lost at Pearl Harbor. They were a signal. The United States was no longer on the defensive. It now had the strength to project power deep into Japanese-held waters. With these new warships, American admirals could send fleets farther, stay at sea longer, and strike harder than before. The speed of the Iowa-class made a difference immediately. They could move with carriers, matching their pace and protecting them from surface threats. This allowed U.S. carrier task forces to operate more aggressively. Instead of hiding behind defensive screens, they could push forward, knowing that heavy guns were close at hand. The battleships also carried formidable anti-aircraft firepower. This meant they could defend not just themselves but the carriers and troop transports that followed in their wake. As American strength grew, Japanese commanders began to feel the pressure. Every island they had captured now had to be defended. Every convoy carrying fuel and supplies became a target. The once stable Japanese defense line began to stretch thin. At sea, patrols became dangerous. U.S. submarines prowled beneath the waves while fast battleships and carriers hunted on the surface. By June 1942, when the Battle of Midway took place, some of the new ships were nearing readiness. While they were not the main factor in that battle, their presence in the broader Pacific Fleet gave Admiral Chester Nimitz more flexibility. Midway was a clash of carriers, and it ended with the destruction of 4 Japanese fleet carriers. It was a devastating loss for Japan. After Midway, the Japanese Navy could no longer replace its carriers and experienced pilots quickly enough. The Americans, however, continued to grow stronger. Each month brought new ships into service. After Midway, the momentum shifted. The U.S. could now plan offensive operations rather than simply reacting to Japanese moves. Battleships were at the heart of this change. They supported amphibious assaults by bombarding shore defenses before landings. Their guns could reach far inland, smashing bunkers, airfields, and artillery positions. When Marines stormed beaches on islands like Tarawa and Saipan, the thunder of battleship shells cleared the way. In fleet engagements, the new battleships were equally important. Their speed and firepower allowed them to confront Japanese surface forces head-on. During the later stages of the war, this strength came to full display at the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944. It was one of the largest naval battles in history. American battleships fought Japanese vessels in fierce night actions, their radar-guided guns finding targets through darkness and smoke. At Surigao Strait, a group of older U.S. battleships formed a battle line reminiscent of earlier naval wars. They crossed the Japanese T and unleashed devastating salvos. For Japan, it was a nightmare scenario. Their fleet, once feared across the Pacific, was now outmatched and outgunned. Many of their ships were sunk before they could even fire effectively. The Japanese response to this new reality was desperation. Unable to match American production, they turned to extreme tactics. Kamikaze attacks began during the later stages of the war. Pilots were ordered to crash their planes directly into American ships. It was a measure born of necessity, a grim acknowledgement that conventional attacks could no longer stop the advancing U.S. fleet. On the surface, Japanese destroyers and cruisers attempted dangerous night torpedo runs. These attacks aimed to surprise American ships and strike before superior firepower could be brought to bear. Some of these operations achieved local successes, but they came at a terrible cost. Each lost ship was irreplaceable. Each lost crew weakened Japan further. In Tokyo, strategy sessions grew more strained with every defeat. Admirals stared at maps marked with retreating lines and shrinking supply routes. They had built their war plan on the assumption that Japan could secure a defensive perimeter and force the United States into negotiation. Now, with American battleships bombarding their island strongholds and carriers roaming at will, that plan was falling apart. For American forces, the growing fleet brought confidence. Soldiers and Marines landing on hostile beaches knew that battleship guns would be firing over their heads, breaking enemy positions before they reached them. Sailors took pride in the power of their task forces, knowing they could bring overwhelming force to any fight. The memory of Pearl Harbor was still present, but it no longer defined them. The contrast between the two sides grew sharper as the war went on. Japan's fleet became smaller and more fragile. Its tactics became riskier, its losses heavier. The United States, meanwhile, expanded its operations. With each successful landing and each captured island, the U.S. moved closer to Japan itself. By the time of the Philippine Sea in mid-1944, the outcome was no longer in doubt. The battle became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot because of the scale of Japanese aircraft losses. American ships, with their superior radar and anti-aircraft weapons, destroyed wave after wave of attackers. Battleships provided a shield for the carriers, ensuring that no Japanese surface fleet could threaten them. At sea, Japanese captains watched this unfolding disaster with grim faces. Some understood that the war was now unwinnable. Others clung to hope, believing that one last decisive blow might change the course of events. But deep down, most knew the truth. The ocean they had once ruled was now dominated by an enemy whose strength seemed endless. The new battleships symbolized this change. They were not just weapons of war, but proof of America's industrial and military power. Each one that appeared on the horizon was a reminder that Japan was fighting a battle it could no longer control. As the war moved closer to Japan's home islands, these ships would play a central role in shaping the final, bitter stages of the conflict. The war in the Pacific was decided long before the final battles were fought. It was decided in the factories, shipyards, and rail yards of the United States. The arrival of 10 new battleships during the middle of the war was more than a display of naval strength. It was a lesson in the true nature of modern war. Ships no longer came from a single dockyard working in isolation. They came from a vast network of industry, with parts built in dozens of cities, shipped by rail, and assembled with speed and precision. Japan had begun the war with a powerful navy and well-trained crews. Its ships were advanced, and its officers were skilled. In the early months, this advantage brought dramatic victories. But Japan lacked the industrial depth to sustain a long conflict. Every battleship it built consumed steel, fuel, and manpower that the nation struggled to replace. Each new ship required years of work, and every loss was a blow that could not be repaired. America faced no such limits. Its industrial base was enormous. When war came, factories shifted production almost overnight. Car plants began to build engines for destroyers and carriers. Steel mills poured metal for hulls and guns. Across the country, entire cities became part of the war effort. The shipyards worked around the clock, powered by a workforce that included men, women, and immigrants from every background. The 10 new battleships were only one part of this machine. Alongside them came carriers, cruisers, destroyers, and submarines. Each month added more ships to the fleet, more planes to the airfields, and more supplies to the stockpiles needed for the island-hopping campaigns. Japan could sink American ships in battle, but it could not stop the flow of replacements. For Japanese officers, this realization came slowly and painfully. At first, they believed victory could be won through superior tactics. They planned to strike hard, win decisive battles, and force the United States to accept a negotiated peace. This was the strategy behind Pearl Harbor and the push across the Pacific. But as the new American fleet appeared, it became clear that tactics alone could not win the war. The enemy could lose ships and men, then return with even greater numbers. By 1944, Japanese commanders faced choices that were no longer about winning, but about delaying defeat. This desperation gave rise to the kamikaze attacks and other last-ditch measures. These acts were courageous and tragic, but they could not change the outcome. A modern war was not only about courage or skill. It was about production, logistics, and endurance. The new battleships became symbols of this reality. Their size and power made them visible proof of American strength. When they steamed into battle alongside carriers and cruisers, they represented more than naval might. They were the result of thousands of workers, countless hours, and a national effort that reached far beyond the battlefield. Some of these ships went on to have long careers. The USS Iowa, for example, would serve not only in World War II but also in later conflicts like Korea and even the Cold War. Today, it rests as a museum ship, open to visitors who walk its decks and see the massive guns that once shook the seas. It stands as a reminder of the moment when American industry turned the tide of the war. For Japan, the stunned reaction of its captains in 1942 foreshadowed the collapse that would come in 1945. Their shock was not only about the appearance of new ships. It was about the realization that they were fighting an enemy whose resources were beyond anything they had imagined. The initial disbelief gave way to fear, and then to grim acceptance. They were trapped in a war they could no longer control. In the quiet of their cabins, Japanese officers wrote in diaries and letters about what they were seeing. Some recorded their awe at the speed of American production. Others wrote of their sorrow as they watched their own fleet shrink while the enemy's grew. These personal words offer a glimpse into the human side of a conflict that often seems defined only by numbers and maps. For the United States, the industrial victory was not a matter of pride alone. It was a necessity. Without the ships, planes, and supplies built at home, the campaigns across the Pacific would have stalled. The Marines could not have landed on Tarawa, Saipan, or Iwo Jima without battleships to clear the beaches and carriers to control the skies. Every step forward in the Pacific was supported by factories thousands of miles away. The lessons of this effort shaped the post-war world. After the war ended, naval power became a cornerstone of American foreign policy. The battleships, though eventually replaced by carriers as the main strike force, remained symbols of that power. Their presence in ports and at sea sent a clear message to allies and rivals alike. Today, when visitors stand on the deck of a preserved battleship, they are standing on a piece of history forged in that crucial moment. They can see the massive guns, walk through the cramped crew quarters, and imagine the noise and energy of a ship at war. What they are seeing is not just a relic of a past conflict, but a reminder of how the war was won. The stunned reaction of Japanese captains was not simply about ships. It was about what those ships represented, the ability of a modern nation to wage total war. Japan's early victories had been dramatic, but they were built on a fragile foundation. America's response showed that true strength lay not only at sea or in the air, but in the factories, the shipyards, and the collective effort of millions. As the war stretched on, it became a test of endurance. Japan fought with bravery and skill, but bravery alone could not replace lost ships or rebuild shattered fleets. The United States, with its vast resources, was prepared for that test. When the 10 battleships sailed into the Pacific, they carried with them the weight of that industrial might, and the outcome of the war began to take shape.